All right. Hello, everybody. We're going to see if the cat will remain calm for the extent of this video. But this is a big one. I've been excited for this. So over the last 12 weeks, I've read every Cormac McCarthy book in order. And for pretty much all of that, it was the only stuff I was reading. So that is, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 of these books. Just sort of drowning in Cormac McCarthy. And it was a really fascinating sort of look into his work. I've been a huge fan for so long. You know, for better or for worse, he is probably my favorite writer. He's definitely my favorite writer, especially just the way he writes and the way he approaches ideas, the way he approaches a story. I love it. It just clicks for me. But the germ of this was at some point I looked at my shelf and I realized I had his whole collection of novels in paperback. I did not have his screenplays or his plays, but of the novels, I had read all of them, some of them multiple times, except for The Orchard Keeper, his first one, and then The Passenger Stella at the end. And there were also a lot in the middle there that I had only read once and that I had been really meaning to reread for a long time but had never gotten around to. So I figured 15 birds, one stone. I went ahead and got the plays, and I started at The Orchard Keeper, and I just worked my way through chronologically, pretty much in order of publication. In order of publication, with the plays being a little wonky in there, just fitting them in where they made the most sense, I felt like. And gosh, it was a lot more interesting than I expected, frankly. It's a thing I'm not going to do again for a while because it was sort of exhausting from a reading perspective, just spending 12 weeks with one author. I started on March 28th. I started The Orchard Keeper. It was a Friday. And I finished Stella on June 16th. It was a Monday. So right around 12 weeks. Just shy of 3 months. And, you know, it was a lot. It's definitely something that I would be intimidated to do with an author with more books, or an author who I didn't already know I really enjoyed. But, you know, if you have a favorite author and they have a somewhat manageable bibliography, I think it's a really interesting exercise, and especially if you're a writer and you care a lot about how certain people write and you want to sort of download as much of that into your brain as possible. Super interesting thing to do. I'm looking forward to whenever I am prepared to do it next. I think I'd like to do it with Toni Morrison. She has actually, I think, maybe slightly less books than McCarthy, or fewer books than McCarthy. I could be wrong, that's off the top of my head. I think she has 11 novels and the one short story, and then Playing in the Dark, which I have read. It's over there. So that would be fun. That would be really interesting too. I might do it with Flannery O'Connor sometime, but because she only has 2 novels, do it with the short stories and then plug in the novels where they would fit in, maybe throw some letters in too. But yeah, let's get into it. I will sort of get into what I found as I go through each one. For better or for worse, I do not have any notes or anything written down. It's just all very fresh in my mind. And, you know, I'll think of it as I get to it, but only thing to do is to start. So, The Orchard Keeper, we can see I got this, I think pre-owned, maybe not, from AFK Books in Virginia Beach. Definitely worth checking out if you're ever in Virginia Beach. This is, you know, it was his first novel, It won the Faulkner Society, I believe it was, the Faulkner Society First Novelist Award back when it came out in '63. And it was, to be so familiar with his work and then coming back and reading this, super interesting. The Faulkner influence is absolutely strong, to a degree where I even felt like I needed to read more Faulkner to absorb the degree to which it is influencing this book, because it's strong. That's another writer I'd like to do this sort of sprint with sometime, is Faulkner. There was also really strong Flannery O'Connor vibes to this one, in a way that I would say much stronger than even any of the rest of his work. Flannery O'Connor was hanging out in this one, and I liked it a lot. You know, this is one where I think I would never recommend anyone start with The Orchard Keeper. This is not one that I'm like, oh, you have to start with this one. It'll really get you hooked on who Cormac McCarthy is. It'll give you a great idea of who he is. It's a first novel, for sure. He's still sort of figuring himself out. He's still, I would argue this is Cormac maybe at like his lumpiest, writing-wise. It's, you know, there are times where it's really working, and then there are times where less so. There's no real moments of where anything clunks, but I finished it, and I was like, that was a good book. Makes a lot of sense that it was his first one. It was by no means my favorite, or one that I was like, oh, I wish I'd read this before I did. But I'm sure I'll reread it at some point. That's about all I have to say about that one. Next, Outer Dark. Read this mere weeks before it was announced that this was getting adapted into a movie. I have mixed feelings about that. Yeah, I have mixed feelings. I have mixed feelings about it. But this is one that I feel like so often McCarthy's pre-Suttree works just sort of get lumped into the same boat, where it's like, oh, he's sort of figured himself out. He's very Faulknerian, very sort of Appalachian Gothic. They're good, nothing special. I would sort of agree with that. I would agree with that with The Orchard Keeper. To a certain extent, I would agree with that. No spoilers, but with Child of God. However, Outer Dark, people sleep on this book, and I don't get it. This is sneakily, I think, one of his masterpieces. That might be my first hot take of this video, and there may be several. But it's, you know, even the first time I read it, because this was my second time reading it, I thought, you know, the language didn't work for me as well the first time, but I don't know, I liked it a lot better this time through. Maybe I was just more ready for how sort of archaic and dense he can get at times, where I think the first time I read it, it felt like it was not serving a purpose, whereas this time I think maybe I just found the rhythm of it a little better, and it really worked for me. But beyond the prose, and I'm going to try and keep this relatively spoiler-free. I might do a whole video alone on specifically Outer Dark, where I get more into spoilery type stuff another time. Trying to keep this one relatively, you know, I want it friendly if you haven't read it. But there is an element that I didn't catch my first time through, and I think from talking to people, a lot of people don't catch. And one could argue it's sort of designed to be missed. It's certainly open to interpretation, right? Basically, there is some aspects of it may only be taking place in a certain character's head, in a way that is never explicitly stated, and is ultimately a matter of interpretation. But I have it back there in Diane Luce's book, Embracing Vocation, she pulls out some pretty interesting quotes from his manuscripts of Outer Dark as he's working on it that confirm that at least that was his intention, but it is also intentionally left open-ended that certain aspects are in a character's head. And then rereading it with that in mind, gosh, this book was so good and so interesting in the way he used silence, in the way like blindness starts to become a real theme or a recurring motif, which will be constant throughout his whole bibliography, is what I found out. So that was fun to sort of start seeing the threads that would get carried through the rest of his career. The idea, several things sort of start in this one that reoccur throughout the whole process throughout the whole bibliography. Sorry, my cat is doing something he's not supposed to. Stop it. One other interesting thing is, and this is my own conjecture, but keeping in mind the sort of Gnostic elements that start cropping up a few books down the line, and being aware of that, I was even starting to catch some hints of that in this one. I'd be curious when. It's probably impossible to really find out, but he left so many notes in his drafts. I'd be curious to see if there is like a particular moment when he starts referencing books he read about Gnosticism or something like that, because already I feel like the threads are showing up. I would argue this book is more bleak than a lot of the ones that people think of when they think of Cormac McCarthy being bleak. And that's also going to be a theme that reoccurs through this video, is I disagree on which of his books are optimistic and which are pessimistic, but we'll get into that later. But if you're up for it, Outer Dark is such like a hidden gem of his books, and so interesting. And I will say the reason why I'm skeptical of the movie adaptation, when I saw that they had cast Lily Rose Depp, I got excited because I thought that meant that Robert Eggers was directing. And I think he is the only director who could do that I'm aware of, which I'm not a film guy by any stretch of the imagination, but I am a big fan of Robert Eggers. And having seen all of his movies, and especially The Lighthouse, I think he could really pull off an Outer Dark movie in a way that no one else can. And then I saw that who'd they cast as Colla? Was it Jacob Elordi? Who's just so tall and Australian and like hunky. And that is not who Colla needs to be. He needs to be like a malnourished Appalachian weirdo. And I don't believe Jacob Elordi can do that. They need like 3 Billboards era Lucas Hedges and to like rub him in some dirt. But I digress. Child of God. This book gets a bad rap. Maybe not a bad rap, but people sort of hand wave it away a lot of times. A lot of big Cormac McCarthy fans. It's definitely some of McCarthy's most graphic and gross stuff, but also done in a really glib way where it almost feels like the closest Cormac McCarthy gets to like a Stephen King type. And I think it's for that reason that this book gets sort of waved away sometimes. And I get it. Reading it, it's his shortest by a lot. And according to Diane Luce's work from Embracing Vocation, it seems like it's kind of just almost started as outtakes from Outer Dark that then became its own thing, where Lester Ballard sort of grew out of some episodes he cut from Outer Dark with Colla. But all that being said, this is some of, I think, my favorite writing of his Appalachian Faulknerian period. There are moments in this that are funnier than Suttree, I would say. And there's more going on under the surface than I gave it credit for initially. Some really strange things with narrative and narration, including the passage that the book gets its title from, where the narrator is describing Lester Ballard, and he describes him as a child of God, much like yourself, perhaps. There are these weird breaks in the narration that it's a thing that recurs throughout McCarthy's work, I found. It gave me, again, no spoilers. I started noticing some patterns in the narration and the interstitial scenes of the townfolk talking that gave me some questions. I have the beginnings of a theory about potentially how much of this is narrative fact and how much is maybe up to, could be called unreliable, let's say. I need to reread it like a third or maybe fourth time to really make a claim one way or the other. But if there's a lot of Child of Godheads out there, I'd be happy to discuss it with y'all. But worth reading. Again, not where I would, if maybe I'll do a tier list at some point. Not in the S tier by any means, not even really in the A tier, but a good book. And if you like Cormac McCarthy, worth reading and worth giving thought to. It's one people kind of write off sometimes, and I do think there's more to it than some people believe. Unlike The Gardener's Son, this book already started on a bad foot with me because it is the only one of all of these that Vintage does not publish. So, this is Echo Books. Clearly, they are trying to emulate all these Vintage paperbacks, and they're doing a pretty good job. But it does bother me when they're all lined up on my shelf, where it's all these Vintage paperbacks, and then this one friggin' Echo, odd one out. First screenplay I've ever read, start to back, front to back, start to finish, and maybe that's part of it. Maybe there's a sort of a way to read a screenplay or a mindset with which to read a screenplay that I just don't understand. Or maybe not. I listened to the Reading McCarthy podcast episode on this, and while I thought the conversation was interesting, and the guest on the podcast seemed to get a lot out of this. In the conversation, it didn't make me feel like I missed anything major in this. It was fine. It was okay. I did think it was interesting that the closing scene of it was a scene that happens almost exactly the same later in Suttree. I don't know which came first, but it was just sort of dropped in, which was odd to read, but interesting, that he liked it. It's sort of an oblique scene, so it's interesting that he liked it enough to include it in two separate works. But, the best screenplay I've ever read, the only one, but the best one. Up next, the big one, Suttree. I read this book for the first time pretty recently. Gosh, when was it? I think it was in November. I was unemployed, so it would have been November. And this is one, again, I talked about hot takes. I love Suttree. This is a great book. It's a really enjoyable book. It's a really funny book. I think it has some great McCarthy moments. It has some fantastic McCarthy moments. But the degree to which it is upheld as one of his masterpieces, I don't know if I agree with. Having read them all now, having read most of them at least twice, I think it is a great book. I think any other author, it would be among my favorites of theirs, if not my favorite. I think it is a little overhyped among Cormac McCarthy's work. There's a lot going on, and it's definitely his most sort of big hairy monster, sort of warts and all, big masterpiece. Or again, I don't know if I think it's a masterpiece, but I respect a big book from an author who is not afraid to take a big swing, and maybe it delivers a lot, while also missing in some ways or being boring or just having some warts to it, but in a way where you kind of feel like it couldn't have delivered to the same extent did it not have those weirder parts or those slower parts or whatever. I think having read Ulysses recently, that's a really great example of like there are parts of Ulysses that I really didn't enjoy, but I don't think the parts that I found like transcendent could have happened or had the same impact were those parts not there. Moby Dick, to a lesser extent, has a little bit of that. I've heard people describe Bolaño's 2666 like that. This is that for McCarthy, I think. It is often compared to Ulysses. I think that is not only fair, I think that is exactly what McCarthy was going for. And there's so much great stuff in here. And I think in a lot of ways, this is one of his books that would bear the most continued fruit of rereading and rereading and rereading and rereading. And I will probably read this 10 more times in my life. But by virtue of how great some of the other books in this stack are, I don't know if I would consider this one of his masterpieces. Maybe I'll eat my words about that in like a year. Maybe I will tomorrow. But for right now, that is where I'm at. However, I think I went into this really wanting to come out feeling like Blood Meridian was overhyped because, I don't know, I did college radio. Like, I'm a contrarian. I'm annoying in that way. I wanted to be able to, like, I prefer his early work. Have you read Outer Dark? And I do, ultimately, I think the degree to which Blood Meridian is now what he's famous for, in a lot of ways, is odd to me because it is so intense, and it is becoming such a monolith in like his cultural impact. But I mean, goodness, what a book. I almost don't want to say too much about it because I feel like so much of what needs to be said about Blood Meridian has already been said. A way that I heard someone describe it once, I believe it was on the Books of Some Substance podcast, that I thought was really insightful and sort of colored how much I enjoyed it this time around, was, this is not a book with a lot of plot, and the person on this podcast said that the way they teach it to their students is sort of that the prose is the plot, and that it is so charged and so compact and so sort of full of potential energy that you're almost reading it like he can't keep this up. It can't stay like this the whole time. And he does it. It's like a high wire act where the writing is so intense in a way that you kind of can't believe he can hold on to that the whole time. There's bound to be some misses, and yet there's not a word out of place in his work, or in this book particularly. It is by no means my favorite of his work. I'm sure I'll reread it. I'm going to stop saying that because that's true of all these, but it's by no means my favorite, but it is, I understand just on a technical level why it has the legacy it does, even if some of the worst guys on the internet are currently obsessed with it. I also think it's really interesting how much of a jump he makes from Suttree, which is, of course, he was working on his whole early career. Forgive me if you hear my cat playing with a toy downstairs. Suttree, he's working on it for basically his whole career until it's published. And it is the pinnacle of his sort of Faulknerian, excessive, I say that with love, but excessive, super southern, super rhythmic writing. Whereas he just compresses down already by here. Not as much as he will eventually, but like it's like a star collapsing in on itself. Like there's so much in Suttree, and then it just becomes this incredibly focused like steam engine in Blood Meridian. I was talking about things that keep reoccurring. in these books. The Gnosticism I brought up in Outer Dark, I feel like is most often mentioned in, like, the most scholarship around it is in Blood Meridian, and that's sort of what put Cormac McCarthy's relationship with Gnostic Christianity on my radar, was people talking about it in relation with Blood Meridian. It came up a little bit in Suttree, I thought, or at least I was picking up what felt like sort of allusions to that as well. But also I studied religion in college, so maybe I'm just primed to look for that sort of thing. There are also some funny ones, specifically that certainly in these first 4 novels and 1 screenplay, and I believe in Blood Meridian too, but don't quote me on that. Cormac McCarthy is constantly describing things as baleful, especially up and through Suttree. This man is obsessed with describing things as baleful. Mute is another one. He loves describing inanimate objects as mute. But this man is fixated on things being baleful. And I would love to know if it's like a book, if it appears in another book that we know as an influence and like he just loved it, or if this was just a word he was into. I get it, man. It's a fun word. It does appear in Blood Meridian, now that I think about it, several times, I think, but not nearly to the extent that it does, that it is almost like a reoccurring character in the books prior to Blood Meridian. Baleful tapers off at about Blood Meridian. But another thing that starts in Suttree and also appears in Blood Meridian and will appear in, I think, all of his books from then on, once each, is the word jinn, D-J-I-N-N, which is, of course, like the transliteration of like the original Arabic word for a genie. It's really odd, honestly, the fact that he sneaks in a reference to a certain character, and often the same type of character, describing him as a jinn in so many books, and 1 each. This is off the top of my head, so someone should fact check me on this, but I know in Suttree there's a point where Harrogate is like crouched over a fire and he's so pale and skinny, and he's described as a djinn. In Blood Meridian, I believe it is the judge at some point, which would sort of be the outlier. Yes, it's the judge. He does not fit the archetype of the characters McCarthy would describe as djinn throughout the rest of it, but in All the Pretty Horses, it's Blevins. In The Crossing, it's Boyd, sorry. In Cities of the Plain, is it in Cities of the Plain? Either it's John Grady at some point, or he skips it in Cities of the Plain. I can't remember off the top of my head. It's not in the Sunset Limited, to my memory. That I could be wrong about that, honestly. In No Country for Old Men, at some point, it's Moss, I believe. In The Road, it's the son. And then in The Passenger, it's the Thalamide kid. And then it does not appear in Stella Maris. But what's going on there? Because if you notice, most of them are these sort of pale, lanky, strange children characters, with the judge being the exception. But the judge is always described as so childlike. And then obviously Moss is a grown man. But I don't know. I've been mulling that over for months now. And I'm still not really sure what that is. Maybe it's just Cormac's little hyperfixation. Maybe there's something more interesting there. The Stonemason play. Play in 5 acts, actually, as it so helpfully informs you right here. I'm not a big play reader. I want to be more of one. I went into this not really knowing what to expect. I enjoyed it so much more than I expected. It has some of the most likable characters in Cormac McCarthy's work, by a lot. And there are moments where you almost get a glimmer of optimism, or just it is not so drearily pessimistic as so many of his books are. Ultimately, I think it does land on the side of sort of pessimism about the world at large and the direction history is heading, which is, but it grants that there's a lot of room to be a good person within there and to be a person doing your best within that sort of decaying history. I really like a lot of the characters in this. I really enjoyed the way it explored work and labor and like the idea of a trade and the value of that, and also stonemasonry as an individual trade was super interesting. It had Cormac quoting Marx, which I didn't expect, quoting MLK. At some point in here, pretty early on, one of the characters quotes, yeah, here it is, page 32 on here. Ben, in one of his Chautauquas, says, the arc of the moral universe is indeed long, but it does bend towards justice, which is, of course, if not a quote, then a pretty direct paraphrase of Martin Luther King Jr. And I think it's unattributed, but it's like such a famous line. Clearly you're supposed to catch that. I think that is sort of the thematic thrust of this whole play, is whether or not that's true. And if it's not true, what does that mean? What are our responsibilities? Really worth a read. If you're not into plays, but you like Cormac McCarthy, start here. Now we're into the fun stuff, by which I mean secretly some of the most devastating books he ever wrote. Border Trilogy. All the Pretty Horses. This was actually my third time reading this, because I read it when I was 18 and missed a lot, but thought it was cool. And it sort of cemented Cormac McCarthy as a writer I liked. And then I read it again. I believe that was also in November, or maybe even sometime last fall, and loved it. And then, so already doubling back is interesting, but this time, of course, it was in the context of all these other Cormac McCarthy books. But it was fun. I used a black pen to annotate it last time and a red pen this time. I'm looking for sort of examples of how marked up this is already getting. It's a book that is proving to hold up to reread, and like, even with so much time passing between my first read and my second read, even if it was only 6 years, 18 to 24 is a big jump as far as like maturity and intellect, I hope. So, it was a different read, but I still remembered a lot more than I thought. It was still a deeper read the second time. Third time, even more so. There's a lot of really interesting stuff in here. I think this one, the Border Trilogy, people sometimes talk about as like, Cormac's done writing these very intense, heavy, well, they're all heavy, they're Cormac, but like these dense masterpieces. And while yes, All the Pretty Horses and the whole Border Trilogy and really the rest of his career is a lot more readable and moves a lot quicker than the first half of his career, do not let that convince you that these are shallow books or that they're not worth reading, because my goodness, All the Pretty Horses is great, but The Crossing, and this is another one of those hot takes, might be his best book. Certainly, in my opinion, it's the best of the Border Trilogy. To me, it is in the top 4 of his novels, absolutely. It might be his best one, or at least the most flawlessly executed of all his books. Again, Outer Dark as the sort of like lumpy, weird early work I love and I think is so interesting and so underexplored compared to a lot of his other works. We'll get to it, but there are some ones down the road, Freudian slip, that I think are maybe my favorite, or certainly my favorite, but The Crossing is so good, so interesting, and such a puzzle. There's so much to sort of work through symbolically, thematically that he's just sort of peppering in there. Stuff with blindness, just the whole notion of like, what is it to see? What do you see better when you've gone blind? Ideas about history, ecology. There's so much going on, and it's stuff that he has planted the seeds for throughout his whole career up to this point. And he will explore basically through the rest of his bibliography. But it's sort of, if you want one book that to me is the Cormac McCarthy book, forget about Suttree, forget about Blood Meridian, forget about The Road, forget about The Passenger. It is The Crossing. If you've read no Cormac McCarthy books and you've made it this far, interesting. You seem cool. But I would recommend starting here. It is a fantastic book. It's so well written. There's so much going on. The characters are great. The story is great. This is not an original thought, but the first 130 pages or so where it's just Billy and the Wolf, that even as a novella, start there. Just read that first section, the Billy and the Wolf section. Read it as a novella. Even if you then go back and read a different Cormac McCarthy book. That's some of his best writing, period. And I love the sort of digressive, the like philosophical monologues that a bunch of the characters get in this, where Billy is just sort of standing around listening. That's some of the most interesting stuff he ever wrote, I think. And of course, that's saying something. Yeah, I love The Crossing. And to my earlier point about, I think, some of the books of his that get a reputation for being bleak, that's overhyped, and some of the ones that don't should. This might be his bleakest book and his saddest book and the most, not nihilistic, but fatalistic of all his books. Even the extent to which Cities of the Plain is a tragedy, and the most sort of like classical tragedy, Shakespearean, Nietzschean tragedy of all of his novels, this is the saddest and the most sort of dejected about our ability to change anything in the world. And it is also the first appearance of the Manhattan Project in his work, which will sort of keep popping up as we go on. So, The Crossing, if you get nothing else from this book, if you like Cormac McCarthy and you haven't read The Crossing, drop everything, read The Crossing. If you have read some Cormac McCarthy and you liked it, but you haven't gotten around to The Crossing yet, read The Crossing next. If you have read The Crossing, I don't care, read it again. Cities of the Plain. This is, I think, one of his most sort of compelling books on a plot level. Even more than No Country for Old Men, I feel like. This one, I hesitate to call it a fun read because it is such a tragedy in the truest sense of the word, in like a literary theory way. It is a Shakespearean, like I said, but it's great. And it is a really interesting sort of tie-up thematically of All the Pretty Horses and The Crossing. I think for a long time I was a little confused about the structure of the trilogy, because it's not a traditional trilogy, you know. There's the first book, and then the second book, which is completely unrelated and takes place before the first book. And then the third book, which is plot-wise also pretty unrelated, but features the characters from the first two. Cool idea, weird way to execute a trilogy. Thematically, I get it now. He is sort of taking all the stuff he explored in the first book, with the idea of like decision-making, and like a lot of sort of esoteric ideas about hospitality and this sort of old world, almost mythological role of hospitality. That crops up in The Crossing as well. The Crossing has a lot more about vision, like I said, blindness, whether or not we have the power to change things at all, really. And then this just sort of mashes all that together in a really interesting way, while also having, I think, sneakily, maybe the best plot in any Cormac McCarthy book. So, Border Trilogy, not slept on, because of course it was the one that put him on the map back in the 90s, but I think people don't give it the credit it deserves all the time. All right, the stack is growing. After finishing Cities of the Plain. So this is when I said earlier that like I read it roughly in order of release. This is where I fudged it a little bit, because the Sunset Limited, I believe, was actually released between The Crossing and Cities of the Plain, but I just wanted to keep plowing through the Border trilogy. And then I felt like, I could see the light at the end of the tunnel as far as this sort of challenge I had set for myself. I knew the next several books were pretty quick moving. And I had never read The Sunset Limited either, but it's one I'd been looking forward to. So I got right into that. Similar to the Stonemason, I think I read it in a day or two. It is the closest I think he ever wrote to just a straight up philosophy book. It's interesting. There were parts of it that I really liked. There are ideas in it that I really liked. He really, in its 140 pages or so, he really sets you up to think it is a very, you really think that like optimism is going to win in a way that feels like out of place for a Cormac McCarthy book. And I don't even think it's a spoiler to say it doesn't really win, because it's Cormac McCarthy. It's not going to be optimistic. But if I have a criticism of it, it is that the way that the optimism ultimately sort of falters, it feels a little, it didn't work for me really. But that was interesting. I want to watch the Tommy Lee Jones, Samuel L. Jackson movie of it. I prefer the Stonemason of his plays, but I thought this was interesting, and even calling it a play, it's apparently a novel in dramatic form, so maybe I'm out of line there. We are in the final sprint now, and it really did start at this point. I was sort of, as much as I was enjoying this and was enjoying getting to read so much of my favorite author, I was also starting to daydream about being done and having so much else I could read once I had sort of completed this arbitrary challenge I'd set for myself. So at this point, I was taking care not to rush, but it did start to feel like a final sprint, which works because the next several books move pretty quickly. No Country for Old Men, especially. I mean, it is the only one of his books that I think is, a straight up thriller. I liked it. This was my first book of his I ever read. I was 17. It was for summer reading, my senior year of high school, and I really liked it then. And I enjoy that there are a couple of goofy little annotations from when I was 17, notably only on the first 40 pages or so, but Miss Savino, if you're watching this, I swear I did read the whole thing for summer reading. You can see here, highlighted some things, and very human country sheriff, old/retired, astute. I don't have a lot to say about this book. It's good. It's interesting. It is, I think, when he really starts to go Hemingway, as he does for the true late career books, just very sparse. Some Beckett in there too. I haven't read any of Beckett's fiction, but from what I understand of it, the sort of very simple, short, fragmentary sentences are almost as much a Beckett thing as they are a Hemingway thing. I don't think I would consider No Country for Old Men one of my favorites of his, but it is a great book. However, if we're talking favorites, another one that falls into the camp of books I hadn't read since I was 18. My goodness, what to say about The Road? This book does something to me. It is obviously one of the more some of the most sympathetic characters of his career, and just like a really upsetting setting in plot. And it's a book of his that gets the reputation for just being like the bleakest book. So sad, so nihilistic. And while I agree it's sad, I really don't. I have said this since I was 18, and on my reread, I'm so much more certain of it. This, I would argue, is actually his most optimistic book. Hear me out. Yes, the setting and the situation that the situations that create that setting and that stem from that setting are terrifying, and they are deeply upsetting, and they are feeling all the more possible with each passing day, and it's scary as shit, and really sad. Like one of the most straight up sad books I've ever read, let alone that Cormac McCarthy wrote. But, and I am trying to say this without any spoilers, because this pertains to like the last 15 pages, 10 pages specifically. The way things resolve, or the way where the book ends, to me, and to I know a few other people I've talked to about this, but certainly not all the people I've talked to about this, feel like a statement that no matter how bad things get, being a good person carrying the fire, sort of trying to do right by the world and the people around you, is worthwhile, and you will never be the only person doing that. I hope that didn't give anything away. But in that way, I think it had a lot in common with the Stonemason, a lot in common with somewhat the Border trilogy, but this one, by far, it seems like he's, if I could psychoanalyze Cormac a little bit, maybe No Country for Old Men is him starting to doubt that, because No Country for Old Men is another one that's really pretty much a bummer. In the Crossing, it is so bleak, like I said, whereas this one I feel like ultimately is an optimistic book, and in a lot of ways I do sort of consider this the end of his career, or his last book. Obviously it is not the last one published, and I'm no expert on how Cormac McCarthy wrote The Passenger and Stella. I know he'd been working on it since 1980, at least. I don't know how much of The Passenger and Stella was written after The Road and how much before. Stylistically, it is very different from The Road. Those two are very different from The Road. To me, this is his last book, and this is sort of the end of the arc of his career. And in many ways, I think there's an interesting arc being drawn, if you'll forgive me for using that word again, starting with Blood Meridian in his career, that is sort of tracking a path of American depravity, you could say, is starting from one point in history. And I know a book that scholars have talked about influencing books of his, and then he actually name drops specifically in, I think it's The Passenger, it might be Stella Maris, is The Decline of the West, I believe it's called, by Oswald Spengler, a book I have not read. I think like a real watermark, if that's the correct word, in the sort of historical pessimism Cormac McCarthy tends to trade in. Starting with Blood Meridian, tracking through the Border trilogy and the Stonemason into the Sunset Limited, into No Country for Old Men, like bringing us up to modern day America-ish, and then The Road being sort of a speculative future, post-apocalyptic future, no less. Like it feels like it is drawing that arc of McCarthy's idea of the decay of civilization, the fall of society, sort of humanity's desire to destroy itself, to destroy each other and ultimately to destroy itself. And yet, I think it ends with him saying that it's worth it and that there is always something to be gained from trying to be a good person, which is really powerful and was all the more powerful for having consumed that arc all in one go the way I did. And again, to me, this is, I don't know if I'd say it's his best book. This is my favorite Cormac McCarthy book. It is his most powerful. It has some of his best prose, I would argue, and I'll die on that hill of his career. And to me, this is where it wraps up nicely. And I think actually to that point about the prose, I do want to read the last paragraph. I don't have any tattoos. I have no real desire to. But maybe I'll just get this paragraph tattooed on my chest, just like in Comic Sans, just straight up the whole paragraph, because it's, God, put this on my tombstone. And this is not a spoiler. Once there were brook trout in the streams in the mountains. You could see them standing in the amber current where the white edges of their fins wimpled softly in the flow. They smelled of moss in your hand, polished and muscular and torsional. On their backs were vermiculite patterns that were maps of the world and its becoming, maps and mazes, of a thing that could not be put back, not be made right again. In the deep glens where they lived, all things were older than man, and they hummed of mystery. And like, damn it, I got chills reading that just now. And I was really focused on not mispronouncing anything. Like, I have goosebumps on my legs just reading that paragraph again. Put it on my tombstone, man. Oh, sorry, I woke up the cat. All right. And now, the last two. And I'm just going to talk about these together, because that is ultimately, they go together. And I will say, this is the one part where I sort of broke out of only reading these books is, I put Creation Lake by Rachel Kushner on hold, the ebook on hold on Libby, like in November, and it finally delivered while I was about 50 pages into The Passenger. So I took a brief pause, or actually it delivered while I was in the middle of No Country for Old Men, but it was going to be due while I was in the middle of The Passenger. So I took like a 2-day diversion and blew through Creation Lake, which was pretty good. But other than that, I only read these books for 12 weeks. So The Passenger and Stella Maris. I read these the most recently. As of recording this, I think I read them just shy of a week ago, or I finished Stella Maris just shy of a week ago. I finished The Passenger about a week ago. I would say I'm still processing them. They're also, other than The Orchard Keeper and The Plays, they are the only ones that I've read a single time each. In a lot of ways, I liked them better than I was expecting and found them a lot more compelling than I was expecting. But in other ways, I do not think they left an impact the way that McCarthy at his best leaves an impact, at least to me. And I'm glad that they were released, and I am glad he was able to put them out before he died. Things wrap up so beautifully with The Road. I'm having trouble sort of squaring these two in my ideation of his body of work. Because again, the timing is a little wonky. He started them apparently in 1980 at least, but also according to that Embracing Vocation book by Diane Luce, there's some indications that maybe he was thinking about these books, or even maybe starting to write them as early as 1963, when he was writing The Orchard Keeper. Like, it's kind of hard to tell how far back in his career these books go and to what extent they wrap up his whole career. While also these are very much like his Santa Fe Institute books, where they're very interested in math and sort of the philosophical implications of math, or the philosophical side of math, of really advanced math. Look, I have not gotten above a C in math since I was 17 years old, and I thankfully have not had to be in a math class since I was 19 years old, so don't listen to me about math. Also quantum physics. Maybe listen to me a little more about quantum physics, but barely. The only reason I didn't get a bad grade in that class is because I didn't take it, or any physics. But I think no one has made me care about math more than Cormac McCarthy. I know some people who actually understand math and quantum physics have maybe had some quibbles with, just have felt like it was just sort of him name dropping mathematicians without demonstrating expertise, but also he is a novelist, so like he's not really claiming to be an expert. I will say I enjoyed these books a lot. I thought they were great books. They need to be read together. Read The Passenger first. Read Stella Maris right after. Don't split these up. Stella Maris fills in the gaps for The Passenger in some interesting ways. I don't think it would be a very interesting book without The Passenger. Though, from like a form perspective, this is, I feel like, the most, besides Sunset Limited, which is of course just a dialogue between two characters, honestly very similar to this in its form, and Sunset Limited is kind of in a gray area as to whether or not it is a play or a novel. This is just a dialogue between Alicia Western and her psychiatrist. It's just told in transcripts of their sessions. It was philosophically, I found really interesting, and a good read and a fast read, much faster read than I expected. I was worried it was going to be very dense. And I think about it often, though of course I read it less than a week ago. I will be curious for the next 50 years of my life. I'll be curious how this book ages as part of his body of work. The Passenger feels, in a lot of ways, it just feels like Suttree 2.0, though I would argue it doesn't have the magic that Suttree has. The prose in these two are definitely Cormac in his least, he has the least to prove, and you can kind of tell. It's great. He's a great, like, it feels very contemporary in a way that feels odd for Cormac McCarthy, and very just sort of natural, but it is great writing, and it is still, it's still McCarthy. You know, I'm really struggling to figure out what to say about these books. I think especially with a book like The Road, like I said, as such a great wrap up to like a career and a body of work, my fear going into The Passenger and Stella Maris was that these would disrupt or tarnish his legacy, or like the spotlessness of his record. Because while I like some of these more than others, there's no real misses. It's a pretty consistent hit rate. Like, he does not have low lows. If you like Cormac McCarthy and you like what he's got going on in his books, you're pretty much going to like any of his books. These certainly did not tarnish his legacy. And I think they're great books. I am struggling to fit them into my schema of his career. And I'm sort of excited to see how that develops as I think about this more. And as, potentially, as time goes on, there might be some posthumous releases, which I don't know how I feel about that. But ultimately, I thought it was still an interesting thematic wrap-up. There's also some stuff about Vision and Black. Like, thematically, he's sort of playing the hits that start with the Orchard Keeper. Also, earlier when I said that The Crossing, the atom bomb pops up for the first time and it becomes sort of theme. The Road, it's unclear what the cataclysm was that caused all this. I think there's a compelling case to be made that it's something atomic in nature. And then The Passenger deals with sort of the legacy of the nuclear bomb and America's deployment of it pretty explicitly, very explicitly. So in that way, it fits in wonderfully. But I'm still wrapping my head around it. I think I'm gonna wrap it up there, just because, I will talk about these for the rest of my life. I could talk about these for another several hours, but I've already spent 2 hours probably recording this. And if you've made it this far, I salute you. Thank you for sticking around. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. If I have terrible takes, let me know. But I'll wrap it up by saying this. If Cormac McCarthy has 3 masterpieces, don't kill me, but I'm going to say, to be a contrarian, but not because I don't believe it, I'm going to say Outer Dark, The Crossing, and The Road. Suck it, Blood Meridian nerds.